Imagine that you had an AI tutor, and the AI tutor knows everything about chemistry and physics. Are you going to learn effectively with this kind of AI tutor? This is the Science of Learning podcast, and I'm Keith Sawyer. My guest today is Professor Roger Azevedo, and he's been studying this question for decades. It turns out that's not the case. Simply because you have an AI tutor who knows everything, that doesn't mean you're going to learn effectively. The missing ingredient is what's inside the learner's head.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Professor Keith Sawyer. Very interesting question. Yes, even though you may have that kind of tutor that could be effective, we always also want to focus on what's inside the learner's heads. And the things that come to mind right away that we know from the science of learning and psychological principles is we need to understand, for example, the learner's cognition, right? What do they know about the topic? So their prior knowledge. Can they plan, especially if it's complex learning? Can they create some sub-goals that are going to be relevant that drive their interaction with the tutor? Kind of also want to focus on their metacognitive skills and processes. Like, are they aware? When does is the student aware of what they know and don't know? How do they monitor and regulate their metacognition? Things that sometimes we forget but are critical ingredients are things also like motivation. Is the student interested in learning? Do they find value in learning about or problem solving, let's say in chemistry? And then what about their affective processes, right? And their emotions. We tend to ignore those also, right? So for example, basic emotions. Are they going to get frustrated? Are they going to get bored? Are they going to be happy? And so thinking really about those, what we would call CAM processes, CAMM, right? Cognition, affect, metacognition, motivation processes really becomes critical in terms of understanding what the student can do and how best to benefit, even from one of the top, let's say, tutoring systems, if you will. And then kind of that develops that human machine symbiosis, right? The question then becomes, is it a sense of self-regulation? Is the student self-regulating themselves? Is the machine, the tutor, able to self-regulate themselves? And what does that interaction look like? And who's doing the monitoring? Who's doing the regulation? Are they taking turns? And your question really reminds me a lot of some of the current research, focusing a lot on human AI teaming, human AI collaboration. And what does that look like if we really are going to have some kind of symbiotic relationship between a human and an AI, if that makes sense?
Well, you've studied AI and learning for decades, and most of us have only been familiar with AI and learning for a couple of years. So tell us about that. What's been your experience with? I mean, has AI been around for decades? What have you been doing? What's your experience with AI going back for more than 2 years?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes. And sometimes it's interesting because you got to remind people that there's actually a field of AI in education, right? Some of us were trained. I especially remember going back to as a grad student at McGill and then doing postdoc at CMU and continuing that. So at least for myself, it's been about 30 years being a part of that field. And so, yes, so there's been a long tradition, right? For example, there are intelligent tutoring systems that really provide cognitive, and help seeking scaffolding, if you will, for students, tends to be more in well-structured domains. And then there are different families of AI. So, for example, we have developed tutoring systems like MetaTutor, which has done some cognition and metacognition. One of the issues that we've seen over the years is that the machine, the AI, if you will, and whether it's a tutoring system or some other type of AI learning technology, is that it has to have an understanding of the learner. So kind of going back to your first question, right? Because if it doesn't, then how is it going to know what the learner needs and how is it going to address the student's individualized learning needs at that particular point in time, right? And what we've seen over the course of learning sciences and ed psych, et cetera, is that a lot of focus on pre-test and post-testing, which of course are important, but that's just a piece of the puzzle. Other folks have developed self-report measures or use self-reports pre and post. But what is really interesting, especially in the field of AI in education, is the use of the multimodal data, right? So for example, while a student is interacting with a system that has some kind of AI, right? We, for example, can look at their eye tracking data, at their facial expressions of emotions, that I'm trying to do right now. not sure if I'm being very successful. It's kind of a combination of happiness and kind of confusion. And then of course metacognition. And so as the student develops, as the system starts to understand or tries to understand what the student's needs are based on these processes that are temporally unfolding, one of the challenges has been, how can we track these processes? What inferences can an AI make about these processes? Because the ultimate goal is to provide that individualized scaffolding, right, that meets that student's individual needs at that particular point in time, right? And so when people talk about AI now, and especially I think when they talk about that, and we see a lot of that in conferences, is they're talking about, for example, Gen AI, right? They're using ChatGPT, they're using, Claude. Well, none of those have a model of the learner, right? They do not really understand. They're just responding to the student. They have, and responding to the student's immediate needs, if you will. So they don't really have a good understanding of what the student's evolving learning needs are. So they cannot, at this point in time, start providing that immediate scaffold that a traditional, for example, intelligent tutoring system would have, if that makes sense. And of course, now to complicate things, now we also not having only Gen AI, right? So one advantage to having a Gen AI is that if we had a Gen AI, for example, pedagogical agent that could scaffold a student in an intelligent tutoring system, is that imagine now as a student, I can use natural language processing. I can ask the system, hey, this diagram, okay, of the K shells in, let's say, gold as a chemical element, right, is very complex. Can you generate a more simpler diagram? So that would be an advantage compared to traditional intelligent tutoring systems. And I think what's kind of being blurred now is people are also now differentiating between Gen AI and agentic AI. And agentic AI seems to be kind of revisiting of what the field of AI in education has been doing for at least, I think we're going on 60 years, like early 70s. So yeah, if that makes sense.
Right, right. So just to unpack some of that, when you talk about knowing what the learner knows, or you've called it a cognitive model.
Cognitive model.
So
Yeah.
it's like the teacher, imagine a teacher in a classroom is going to be more effective if that teacher looks out at those 20 students in the classroom and understands that one student is more advanced than another student. So the teacher is going to provide more help to the student who doesn't know as much. And of course, that teacher is going to be more effective because that teacher can tailor what they're doing with each of those students. So you would think an intelligent tutor, meaning an AI, if that intelligent tutor can modify what it's doing for each student's ability, then that intelligent tutor is going to be more effective. So that's what you're talking about, right? When you say cognitive model, you mean understanding what each student knows.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's what's exciting right now with some of these Gen AI or even agentic AI tools and techniques is that now, just like you described it, Professor Sawyer, is this kind of very fluid interaction. And imagine now a student, in the old days, we can do this, a student now asking, let's say, a pedagogical agent. So, for example, explain to me, right, why you are showing me this particular instructional content, because we also tend to hide that from the student, right? So kind of empowering the students also and providing them with more agency and being able to naturally talk to an artificial agent as opposed to typing something that may be impoverished. Because, I mean, if you're a student, especially, a younger student, do you really want to start typing everything instead of talking like we're doing, right? Or pulling down from a menu or clicking on a box. Those were techniques that we have used in the past, continue to use, but make it more naturalistic like we're engaging right now. And I think there is a misconception in that, which is also a challenge for AI, is will an AI really understand what a human is asking for? So imagine a student saying, I really don't understand why you keep giving me this type of scaffolding. Now, a teacher, a tutor, right, another human might be able to understand that and unpack that and give a student an accurate response. But will an AI actually understand that sentence, that phraseology, that request, right? If you will, right? Um, which is a good challenge and keeps advancing us. I think related also to your question, if I may expand on, I think one of our frustrations in developing these AI systems is also that, yes, we have wonderful models, right, and theories and frameworks in learning sciences, in educational psychology and psychological sciences. But they're either too high level, and if I can be critical a little bit, they're either too high level or too abstract. Like, for example, sometimes you go to conferences, somebody say, well, I use Piaget's, cognitive equilibrium model. It's like, okay, but can you really tell when the student is going through a simulation or accommodation or zone of proximal development? Like, how do you even as a teacher know what each student's ZDP is, right? Let alone having an AI do that. So the question is, and if you think about self-regulation and metacognition, and then yes, we have very abstract and very prescriptive models. But I think part of our frustration is in designing these AI systems, right, to tutor or to teach students, is imagine you had the most challenging student in terms of their cognition, their emotions, their motivation, their metacognition. And we can track that. Imagine we have an ideal, we know exactly what to do for that student. The question is, where do we draw and from what do we draw from in terms of coming up with prescriptions? Because I have a student with all those challenges. I think the last thing, right, that we want to do is start modeling sophisticated cognitive strategies, right? Do we have to take care of their motivation and emotions first and then build onto that? So thinking about our models and theories and frameworks, when are we going to get to more prescriptive, right? As we are able to also collect more fine-grained level detailed data on these temporal unfolding processes as students interact or learn. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I know that you actually have built these computer systems, these
Mm-hmm.
artificial intelligence systems. You mentioned MetaTutor, and you called it an intelligent agent, I believe, or
Mm-hmm.
a pedagogical agent, which I guess I can translate into a teacher, but
Yeah,
it's a
absolutely.
computer that's a teacher, pedagogical agent. Uh, is is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And some of those, and even though we, for example, in MetaTutor, we had four agents. So then the students also get to learn to associate. If it's Mary, the monitor who shows up, it's about your metacognition. If it's Sam, the strategizer, right? Or Pam, the planner. So what's interesting is that, yes, even though, and that was based on our ability to detect either based on time thresholds or activities that the students are engaging in to make the best inferences about what to scaffold and how to scaffold and provide feedback for the student, right? But now, one limitation of that system and current systems to a certain extent is that none of those agents exchange information about the student. So imagine a cognitive agent and metacognitive agent talking to each other, and describing the kinds of data. And the question is really, what are we going to do for the student, right? Because we're also under the assumption that these AI systems have the perfect answer, and they don't, right? So we try to do as much as possible in terms of pushing the theoretical frameworks that we have and the empirical data, but they're still not perfect, right?
So you have this system MetaTutor, and there are four pedagogical agents, which you say they have names. So they're
Yes.
actual, like a video or a video game. There are four characters walking around on the screen,
Yeah.
and they come and they're talking to the student, and each one of them has a different personality, and they each serve different functions or different pedagogical functions for the student. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So to us, it's typically a kind of a headshot. Absolutely. There are some models, some other systems that have either full body or half body. For example, our Gracers, Auto Tutor. Some of them actually had an arm to kind of be a little more engaging. Some games do have full-bodied, agents walking around. To us, what was more important is because we were focusing on cognition, metacognition. We didn't really. I mean, all we needed is almost like a talking head, if you will. But now, one thing that we've learned very quickly is that, and of course, just as a reminder, that system was built about 15 years ago. So the agents were not like us, they were not three-dimensional. So it's very interesting to pick up on the fact that the students very quickly stopped looking at the agent because the agent was talking or writing what they were saying. So there was a little redundancy in the system. So if it's almost like if the agent, just like a teacher or like we're doing right now, is not actually emoting, if you will, or providing any kind of facial expressions so that we can continue engaging in our discussion, if it's not going to do that, then I don't need to look at it because I can just listen to it. So now some of our more sophisticated agents are more three-dimensional, and so that we try to make it as natural as possible, and also use them strategically and experimentally to try to induce metacognition, or it's if we know what the student is doing and if they're going down the wrong path, for example, let's say they're reading or trying to interpret something that is irrelevant for what they're doing, then imagine the agent in real time kind of looking a bit confused, just like a teacher would, right? Or a tutor. And hopefully the question is, would that facial expression trigger that like why does it look confused? Am I doing something wrong or not spending enough time on irrelevant information? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you could do this in a virtual reality where the students are putting on headsets. I think you've done that. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So we've tested some, especially with math. Absolutely. Yeah. And then the question becomes, and then in that kind of environment, we can actually start thinking about those agents, if you will, as actually collaborators, as partners, right? Is it a peer or is it purely just there to scaffold or guide me? Absolutely. And the beauty of these AI-based systems is that we can use them both as educational or teaching or learning training environments, but also treated them as research tools, right? Because we can very quickly on the fly switch the mode in which that agent is, I guess, behaving or operating under, right? Yeah.
Right. One thing that I'm so fascinated about with your research is it's not just fancy technology, but that you are a learning scientist and a science educator. So you are using this technology with the goal of helping them learn science. So you don't stop at the technology, but you actually embed science curriculum in it. So how do you do that? How do you go from just fancy technology to tying that into science concepts?
Yes, no, no, absolutely. So we always work in interdisciplinary teams, right? So, for example, as you said, I'm the learning scientist, the psychologist. We're like the chameleons, right? A learning scientist, educational researcher, cognitive scientist, cognitive psychologist. Um, so we try to understand as much as possible in terms of what the human is doing, right? In terms of from our very strong traditions of empirical work and collection of data and analysis of data. And then we will always, so if you think about a triad, so we're the psychologists, then we will work with our colleagues, right? It can be an industry partner or a colleague in computer science or engineering, or on focuses on game-based learning, for example. One of the great examples is our extended collaboration, for example, with Dr. James Lester, NC State, right, in terms of the national, like we've done a lot of work with his team on Crystal Island, which is learning about microbiology. Completely different approach than intelligent tutoring system, right? And so we will always have those that are the software developers, if you will, our computer science colleagues who will also create the data pipelines, be able to do the machine learning algorithms that could provide part of that scaffolding solution to the student. And then we will always work with our subject matter experts. So we'll work, for example, with high school. So, for example, right now we have a new NSF project called Medicine. So we're working with high school algebra teachers and really trying to understand what are the challenges in algebra in high school. And so we'll work with the teachers to provide the curriculum, because we never want to impose, right? We are not the teachers or the faculty teaching the specific, let's say, engineering classes. So we'll work with faculty, we'll work with teachers. In some of our projects, we will work with the chairs and the heads of emergency departments, the College of Nursing nurse practitioners who are in charge of training nurses and the curriculum. So that we are not imposing, right, in terms of curriculum, if you will, and training objectives, and that any content that we put into these environments is always validated by the experts. So, yeah, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think, yeah, it does. And not only are you wrapping in this kind of science content, and I think you could do this in any subject area, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Uh, so you have to have this kind of team because you got the technology, you got psychological understanding of what's going on in someone's head when they're learning, and then you got the content area expert. So
Yes.
I mean, it sounds like you're doing a lot of different projects because you've got nursing, you've got chemistry, you've got biology. Uh, how many different projects do you have going on at any
Uh,
one time?
I think right now we have 15 different projects. Yeah. And they
Right. And
span, yes, like you said, everything from middle school to high school, math and science, and even different science topics to undergrad, for example, graduate and graduate training. So, for example, data science is an SF project. To then we also have some military projects because now you're talking about the decision making in real time. Nursing, training of nursing practitioners, emergency medicine, pediatric residents. So the fun part about all these projects is because we are not the experts in the content, that we actually get to learn some of these subject matters also, which is very exciting. So, for example, just before our meeting, I just got off. We had a meeting with the College of Nursing, and we're talking about medical interruptions and the importance of medical interruptions and how do we train for medical interruptions so that we minimize the harm to patients, right, because of medical interruptions, and especially nurses that are interrupted all the time, whether it's colleagues, students, the patients, family members. So we can simulate those with other types of AI technologies, such as high fidelity mannequins, which are the computer, if you will, right, or the technology. Yeah.
you used a word very early in our interview, which I wanted to return to, and something multimodal.
Ooh.
And
Mhm.
your research has touched on something called multimodal learning analytics. So, uh, say a little bit about that. What is that? Sounds pretty complicated, but I think you could break it down so that anyone could
Yeah.
understand it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, thank you for that. Yes. So, as a psychologist, Uh, again, we can collect pre-test, post-test, and far transfer. That's very traditional in terms of learning science and ed psych and cognitive science and psychology. We can do self-report measures that test people's self-perceptions, right? It could be about somebody's interest or motivation. However, what we've been missing is what are the psychological processes, right? Learning processes, reasoning, decision making, thinking about the very high level processes that humans engage in that happen in real time, right? And it could be human machine interactions. So, a student, like when we started off, a student, for example, using a tutoring system for chemistry, it could be two students or three students using a game simulation environment to learn about microbiology. It could be multiple AIs. So, what we're interested in is we would really want to study the temporal dynamics of how those cognitive, affective, metacognitive motivation processes unfold in real time. So, imagine a student sitting in front of a computer, just like we're doing right now, wearing a portable eye tracker. Actually, we would actually have an eye tracker sitting at the bottom of the monitor, right? And there we would be able to study, for example, their eye movements. Because, so for example, where are they paying attention to, right? Are they then paying attention to the right instructional material, for example, or training material? What inferences can we make? Can we talk about how we could derive strategies from their gaze behavior pattern, right? Because our eyes are always moving. And the question is, what are they doing? Because that's important. So eye tracking, we'll do things like facial expressions of emotions. We want to see, for example, when does a student go from neutral to confused? Because the question is, as a psychologist, we would want to know what is causing confusion, right? Is it the complexity of the instructional material? Or, for example, they just got feedback and they don't understand what let's say, the pedagogical agent is asking for. When we saw that in MetaTutor, it's like the agent's asking you to summarize, and they're like, I don't even know what summarization is, but we know that that's a good cognitive strategy. So facial expressions of emotions, things that we're talking about, sometimes they do a think aloud, sometimes it's discourse, right? So if a student is reading and then all of a sudden says, oh, I don't understand that. That's beautiful because linguistically we can segment that and we can map that utterance to a metacognitive process. If they are whatever they're clicking on, so we collect log file data. The students are not usually aware of that. So at the millisecond level, we know exactly. So imagine having a long, very long Excel file. At the millisecond level, we know exactly what the student was looking at, what they were paying attention to, what they clicked on, what they entered, if they were doing some kind of assessment. And then depending on some cases, we also will have electrodermal activity bracelet that they will wear. Okay, and so there, for example, let's say we know what your baseline physiological level of arousal is, and all of a sudden, let's say you're still back in that chemistry tutoring system, and all of a sudden it's like you get a more challenging question, and now imagine there's a spike beyond your baseline, right? The question we want to know as psychologists is that spike in your level of arousal psychologically meaningful? So we're always looking for that meaning, right? Because if it is, then that means that the systems instructionally do something, or from a scaffolding perspective. So all of these, so we collect, and then there's more, either movement, for example, if it's an immersive environment, nonverbal behavior, and then multiple cameras depending on the context. If we're in a classroom, if we're in a lab, if we're in a hospital setting, in a military setting. And so that's the multimodal data, because each of those data channels, right, either adds redundancy in terms of, for example, a specific process, or provides data that is very specific. So if I'm looking for people's attention, we'd want to use eye tracking data, right? But if we're trying to figure out if a student is actually understanding what they're doing, then we probably want to use language, right? And then in some cases, we have to converge across data channels. And what these all have in common is, from a psychological perspective, is we want to know not only how they temporally unfold, right? What triggers the changes and transitions. So, for example, if a student is neutral and all of a sudden they go from neutral to confused, what happened at the instructional level, but also at the internal level and external level that led to that confusion? And how long is that? What's the duration? And then where do they transition to? Right? Because hypothetically, once we have these models, we can embody these models into an AI machine, right? So that it can do something in terms of addressing the student's individual needs in real time, right? If that makes sense. Sorry, that
Right.
was a
So,
very long answer, Professor Sawyer, to your question, but it is complex.
well, it's a huge amount of data. So you're
Yes.
talking about your
Mm-hmm.
eyes are moving around on the screen. So you're using
Yeah,
the software and you're the learner. So the eye tracking can see if you're looking at the third line on the screen, or if you're looking at the bottom of the screen, or if you're looking at the left or the right of the screen.
absolutely. Yeah,
And then your data analysis or knows what's on the left side of the screen. So it knows what you're looking at, right?
absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And we would love to do in real time. So imagine it's so from a data collection perspective, we can do that in real time. Now imagine that real time data, and because we're working with teachers and the different pedagogical experts, right, who are providing the content. So imagine now we can detect that a student is reading an irrelevant piece of text or analyzing part of a diagram that makes absolutely no sense for what their current goal is, right? The question is, imagine if we had that in real time, that could trigger, because the AI is watching, right? And we know that, what are we going to do for that student? Are we making the assumption that student is very just interested in that topic? So that's why they're reading exhaustively? Or are they not making an accurate metacognitive judgment that, hey, this piece of text right here is irrelevant? And that's the biggest problem that we have, is because we go back to, what would a teacher do? What would a tutor do? Right? Would you ask the student, are you continuing to read because you're interested in this topic? Or do you think this is relevant to your current sub goal? And that's typically what a pedagogical agent should be doing, right? Some systems just make the inference. Here's the problem. If you make the wrong inference, then you can literally derail the student's learning trajectory, right? So yeah, so establishing what we call the ground truth is always important. And some of these agents now are sophisticated enough that they can do that, just like a human tutor would.
So you have to know a lot about what goes on in the mind of the learner when they're learning. So that's pretty advanced cognitive psychology. And then you have to know a lot about the structure of knowledge in the domain. So if you're learning physics, you have to know a lot about the conceptual structure of physics and
Mhm.
how different concepts are connected. I mean, that's the kind of thing I love learning about. I love being I mean, it is what I'm an expert in as
Yeah,
a learning scientist. So that's pretty advanced understanding. That's what learning scientists do, and it's the cutting edge of learning sciences, wouldn't you say?
absolutely, absolutely. Yes. And I think now we're getting to a point where it's almost like, can we take this multimodal data, right? We talk about, plenty of work over the last, 5, 10 years on teacher dashboards, right, which we present to teachers. But what about a student dashboard? Yes, let's empower the teachers so they can make good instructional decisions, right? But what about that multimodal data? So how do we take that data, that raw data that we're being fed, right? And how could we re-represent it and, if you will, kind of give it back to the learner as some part of their interface,
Uh,
right? Um, it always reminds me of Phil Winnie's like thinking about the learner as a learning scientist. Give me my data, right? Let me play with my. So imagine now, learning is also learning to understand, because sometimes we'll say like, well, you weren't really paying attention to the right thing, and it's like it's always verbal, right? But now we have the power to show me that I wasn't doing that, right? So we can do that. So can we, if you will, either take the raw data, if it makes sense, and present that to the learner, but walk them through. So part of scaffolding is that scaffolding you through your multimodal data, right? Oh, I didn't even realize that I was actually looking at the right thing, and kind of like, why was I doing that? So getting the student to kind of this evaluation reflective process. And the question is that effective? Right. Now that you're aware and you've had an opportunity to either reflect if you can on your own, or maybe it has to be mediated by someone who can actually help you reflect, right, on the process or processes.
yeah. So if your computer system, so we're talking about a computer that has a model inside it of what the learner knows,
Hmm.
a cognitive model of what the learner knows. So then why not show that cognitive model to the learner?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty heady concept. So you have a display on the screen. Almost maybe it's like a 3D representation, and the learner can see inside their own cognitive model. Uh, yeah, yeah, I get it. So why not show it to the learner, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then can we get to the point where it's like, okay, well, now I have a better understanding, right, of what my understanding about, let's say, how electrons, circulate around the nucleus. Um, I am now ready for more complex and challenging problems, right? Can you set up a curriculum dedicated to what I want to learn next? If you think that's where I should be going, right? And kind of, again, empowering the student, giving the student more agency, right? Because I think what's happening with a lot, well, most of the technologies that exist out there, if there is no AI or limited AI, all the students are getting this kind of one size fits all. Right. And are we punishing students? Because if I have already shown mastery, but I have a deep conceptual understanding of some, physics concepts or chemical properties, why don't you adapt the curriculum to my needs, right? As opposed to having everybody go through the one size fits all, because that's easier to do, right? And is that where we're losing students? Because then it's like, well, I already know this. Like, I'm bored. Like, I don't want to do another 10. Why are you punishing me, if you will, with another 10 to 20 problems when I've already clearly showed that I've mastered or understand this concept, right? Yeah.
So imagine I'm still fascinated with this concept of the learner getting a chance to look at their own cognitive model through the computer screen.
Yep.
So this is what's inside their own head, and they're looking at it. So it might be wrong, right? They might have the wrong understanding of whatever physics that they're trying to learn. So you would want this computer display to tell them that it's wrong. So let's say the right part of their cognitive model is highlighted in green, and the
Uh-huh.
wrong part of their cognitive model is highlighted in red with the big red arrow pointing at it. Uh, so if it's green, now you're saying don't give them 10 more problems. Just say, good for you. It's all green. Now you can advance to the next unit,
Yes.
I guess. Is that it?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But then that also assumes that we're taking a very learner-centered approach to instruction, right? Which, unfortunately, more, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but most K-12 is not very learner-centered or very minimal learner-centered, right? So it's like, so that's a big issue. And then this is also related to one of the new projects that we have. There's the concept of a simulated learner. So now I imagine a simulation environment. That's one of the projects that we have now with our colleagues in computer science, and one of our local schools, Seminole County Public Schools, is algebra word problems. So imagine now a student is able to have a simulated learner. That simulated learner is an avatar that lives in this environment. And now we're switching the roles. The role is that you, as a learner, you are teaching your simulated learner how you would solve that algebra word problem. So we're forcing the students to really externalize both symbolically, right, in terms of writing formulas, verbally. And then the idea is that once you've finished teaching or how you would solve that problem, we're also kind of training students on self-regulation. You may also indicate, you know what, at some point during this process, I might also get frustrated, but I don't know what to do about it. But that's beautiful because you know that so your simulated learner should also show some level of frustration and lack of ability to regulate their particular negative emotion. So then the idea is once you finish teaching it, right, now imagine it goes into a simulation mode where now your simulated learner is actually hovering over the screen and solving the problem the way you said it would solve the problem. And what we're trying to do there is the fact that as learners, we never really get to see ourselves from our perspective. It's always somebody else's perspective, right? So the idea is to raise our metacognitive awareness of strategy use, metacognitive monitoring, etc., accurate problem solving. But what the students don't know is that these simulated learners sometimes will also deviate. They'll create other problems or errors, right? Or new strategies. And the idea is like, oh, wait, you just used that strategy that I didn't teach you. Tell me more about that strategy. And what we want to do is the other thing that we're finding in the literature is that we're good at teaching declarative knowledge about, let's say, metacognition. What is it? How to engage in metacognition, right? But we're not really good at is that transfer, if you will, in terms of do I use the same metacognitive strategy, whether I'm doing physics or reading history, right? That conditional knowledge, how do I apply that to multiple domains and multiple tasks and problems potentially? So, yeah. So,
Well, we
sorry.
haven't talked about metacognition that much yet, and I know it's a big part of your research. So
Mhm.
could you unpack that? What is metacognition, and how does it help you learn?
Yes, absolutely. So metacognition, thinking about, as you are learning, whether you're reading, writing, talking to someone, answering a question, whatever the activity, right, and broadly construed as learning or reasoning activity, problem solving, is kind of, if you wanted to break it down in terms of awareness. So, for example, as I'm trying to answer the teacher's question, as I'm answering the question, am I really aware? Like, am I really answering that question? Or as I'm reading something new about, let's say, photons, well, I knew about electrons and neutrons, but like now photons, I'm not really sure as I'm reading this, like, this is becoming really complex and I don't understand it. So that awareness, right? And so we go from an awareness to a monitoring, because then if I'm going to put some effort into monitoring, right? So that means that as I continue to read about photons, I better really monitor where I'm understanding this. So there's the monitoring perspective. And then, you know what? I've already spent 5 minutes reading about this and I really don't understand this, but I know it's relevant. Now I need to regulate, which would see is kind of the third phase. And of course, I'm presenting these linear, but they're obviously not linear, right? Then I regulate, but regulation really involves some kind of strategy. So what strategy would I use? Would I go back and reread? Like if we're going back to reading comprehension literature, reading would be great. I may be taking some notes, I may be some highlighting. So I got to regulate. And then now as I'm monitoring, as I'm reading, because now I'm monitoring and regulating at the same time, if you will, I should also be evaluating if the new strategy that I'm using are actually helpful, right? And then we kind of end up with reflection, which is always seen as this kind of post learning, post problem solving. So looking back at the fact that I spent, let's say, the last 2 hours studying, right, about photons, was I really successful? Did I use the right strategies? What struggles did I have? And how could I change? This is where the activity comes so that tomorrow, when I continue studying or later on, what am I going to do different? Right. So that kind of completes the cycle. So we think about awareness, monitoring, regulation, evaluation, reflection, and then adaptivity, right, which will be the continuous cycle. Now, of course, they're recursive, they feed back to each other, etc. Yeah, if that makes sense. Kind of at a very high level.
Right. So you are the learner. Let's see. And I know you've done a lot of
Yeah.
research in college specifically.
Mhm.
So how
Yeah.
can you help someone be a more effective learner in college? And a lot of college students are start out anyway not being effective learners, so they have study habits that we know are not effective study habits. I had Professor Henry Rodiger on the
Oh,
program,
yes. Yep.
and he's done research on the same thing. So your research has direct and practical implications for students and this metacognition. So give us an example of how a learner can learn more effectively based on your research on metacognition.
Yes. So part of that is training, right? We could train students, right, in terms of like the model I just described. It could be presented as I kind of shortly presented to you, kind of at a very abstract level. But I think what would be the advantage is if we use any kind of learning technology that we can go into much more in depth, right? Because you can have an agent actually model, right, in terms of, let's say, the photon, example I gave in chemistry, right? I could actually model that for the students, right? In terms of really articulating. And I wish, and I'm hopefully this is not being too disruptive, but I just wish, for example, teachers would teach about metacognition to students, right? They don't, right? Even your typical faculty member doesn't, right? Because why would they be a learning specialist? I mean, right? To be honest, but why not? And it has to be infused in the subject matter expert, right? So I do that in my classes a lot. So, for example, I'll throw up, an abstract in my research method grads class. So we'll throw up an abstract, right, from a study, and it's like, okay, well, let's start reading this, and as we are reading this, right, let's be very mindful. Like, is there something that we don't understand? If we don't understand, how do we know we don't understand? What is it that you don't understand? And then what are we going to do about it? Because you're going to be part of this class is that you're going to be using strategies and learning about strategies, right? So kind of modeling that, but to be honest, Professor Sawyer, to do this in person in real time, I have to tell you that it's really exhausting because there's so much you're you're unloading, if you will, all these things that we take for granted, right? In terms of how do I verbally model as I'm doing it for you that I'm aware, I'm monitoring, I'm regulating, I'm evaluating, I'm reflecting at the same time. And so there have been, if you look at the literature, so there have been many attempts to do this, right? Regardless if it's younger children, uh, college students, adults, professionals, right? There's ways of modeling this either very abstractly. Part of that training actually is to show them some of the models and frameworks that we actually have in the literature. So if I imagine one of the things I do is, for example, I'll take the Winnie and Hadwin model that we use extensively in 1998 and actually, Phil's 2018 version, which is identical. And we will literally walk students through the flowchart that he's developed, right, which is his model. But then as we apply to some kind of problem, whether it's in math or research methods, et cetera. And that can be done, right? So that's one way of doing it. I think what we also need to do is take that to the next level. Is actually do more training of, for example, metacognition and self-regulation using these intelligent systems, if you will, right? Where they can actually model some of these processes more accurately, if you will. So yeah. So I'm not sure if I completely answered. See, here I am. I'm kind of doing this on purpose. I'm not sure if I completely answered your question.
It's such rich and deep and complex research that it would take hours to
Sorry.
completely answer the question. But I know because I know your research so well. But when you say things like monitoring and reflecting and regulating, so I mean, simplistically, you could say the learner should be aware of whether they have learned it effectively. I mean, you should know, do you really understand it or not?
Yeah,
And a lot of learners, they kind of read it and they zip through it and they don't really know if they understood it or not because they're just trying to get through the reading and finish it.
I'm finished.
So they
Yes,
don't even stop and think about whether they
that's right.
understand it. And then the next morning they wake up and maybe they didn't understand it and then they don't get a good grade on the test. So that's the sort of thing we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And then the question becomes what kind of technology could we use to facilitate or to support or even to foster those processes, right? And what's great about the research that we do is that we have so many different types of different learning technologies, right? And different levels of artificial intelligence, if you will, that we could strategically take advantage of very specific affordances of the different technologies, right? So, for example, if we have a low prior knowledge student who has, challenges with metacognition, self-regulation, it might be as exciting it might be to put them in front of a game-based learning environment. Well, all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I got so many choices to make, et cetera. That's probably not the best solution, right? We may want to start with something that's much more structured, like a tutoring system that can keep them on, rails while giving them flexibility. And once they show conceptual understanding or mastery, then let them continue. Let put them more in a exploratory environment where they can, explore and learn at the same time. So yeah, which is another issue, right? Is how best to use these different technologies, right, with or without AI, to really foster those metacognitive and self-regulatory processes in students. But we have to know their profiles, right?
As a teacher myself, the only way to help a student do that is to constantly assess them. You have to, let's say, give
Yes.
them homework every single day, and then
Hmm.
you grade it every single day. And so the next day they know if they understood it or not because they get a
Hmm.
bad grade. But
Yeah,
you just can't do that. It's humanly not possible to
that's right.
grade students every single day. But so you grade them after the second week and you grade them after the fourth week. And then if they don't understand it, they get a bad grade and it's too late. So I think that's the power of using these intelligent tutors is that you can give them feedback. I mean, in some cases, really second to second. All right.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And and address their individual needs, right, as best as possible. Right.
So
Absolutely.
are you doing this? You're tying into these intelligent tutors. You're wrapping in this metacognition and this self-regulated learning. It's all it's all connected,
It's
all
all
this
connected.
research.
Absolutely. Because fundamentally, any learner, any human, right, needs to be able to, engage in metacognitive processes and self-regulate, right? I mean, whether it's you're dealing with, let's say, for example, personal relationships, you know learning. I mean, it doesn't matter what the aspect of life is, right? I mean, you have to engage in metacognition at some level and be able to self-regulate. So it's very fundamental to all humans. So this is what we love. And the question is, how do we cater, and what does metacognition self-regulation look like? Is it different across different learners and tasks and domains? uh, and or are there things that are very generic to, you know monitoring, right? So
One thing we haven't talked about
yeah.
is does it work? Uh,
Does it
so
work?
what's the
Uh-huh.
evidence? And I know the answer, but I'd
Uh-huh.
like to have our listeners hear it. So, is there evidence that if students can self-regulate their learning better, Do they learn more effectively? And is there evidence as these intelligent tutors that you're developing with the cognitive models, et cetera, do
Yeah.
they learn subject matter more effectively?
Yes, the evidence. So if we are testing them immediately after, for example, some kind of metacognitive SRL training, self-regulation training, there's usually obviously a huge impact from pre to post. Okay. But guess what? We're measuring it just focusing on declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. A true test, I think where we need to go as a science of learning is a true test of their application is to give them another problem, a more complex problem. Think about the transfer, right? All the transfer literature that we have in cognitive psychology for decades, right? How do we test near and far transfer of your metacognitive skills over time, right? Because some of what we see sometimes is also mimicry. Oh, the agent told me to do this, so I'm just going to mimic, just like you would do with a teacher or a tutor, a human tutor, right? The question is, when are you truly a self-directed, self-regulating, independent learner that can do that on your own without any kind of prompting, right? So we need to come up with better methods, more accurate methods to test the effectiveness of these kinds of trainings. Plus, we also need to emphasize that the training of metacognition, self-regulation also has to focus on conditional knowledge, right? The application. Do I, for example, engage in help seeking all the time? Well, there might be cases where you should, and cases where you don't. Or am I even aware that I'm not really good at monitoring my emerging understanding, but I'm really good at monitoring the kind of feedback that an agent is trying to provide? So then, how do I differentiate between those? Um, so yeah, so we need a lot more of those, and I think part of the solution is what we were talking about before, is to basically give students back, if you will, or have them play, quote unquote, with their data in a way that is trying to foster transfer, right? Trying to foster effectiveness of use and transfer these processes and skills over time, right? And across disciplines.
Well, you said you're doing it in your own college classes, that at the beginning of the semester, you teach them or give them a practical advice about how to self regulate their learning. Is
Self-regulate,
that right?
yes. Yes, I try to infuse that in any class that I teach, whether it's research methods, where we have students, for example, from engineering, computer science, who may have limited research experience or research method and stats, to students that come, from psychology to us or from other domains. And then same thing in terms of the more challenging one is when I teach an understanding humans for modeling and simulation, which is almost like a learning sciences that, we borrow a lot from your book, from your handbook and other handbooks. It's basically teaching the science, the psychology of learning. And so it becomes, because very few of them have that kind of background, it becomes even more um, important to model these processes, especially the metacognitive and self-regulatory process for them, because they will look at, for example, you know, your introductory chapter, and it's like, my gosh, what is learning science? What do you study? What does a psychologist study, right? Or, you know, uh, here are models of cognitive architectures. What does that mean? Because it is so abstract. So teaching them how to read those articles, teach them how to use strategies. So because it's like you don't have to get down into the minutia because you're not going to be tested on that. How do we teach you for conceptual understanding so you have an understanding, but you can actually still engage in a you know in a discussion, if you will, academic related discussion. Mm-hmm.
Where do you think that the field of AI in education should go? Where would you like things to go in the coming years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of them is to continue to start using these simulated learners, um, where students really start thinking about their own thinking, if you will, which is really fundamentally metacognition, right? And now imagine that you also have a simulated learner of yourself, right? Now you can make hypotheses, right? Well, good. Next week, we're going to have a new chapter. It's going to be more conceptually challenging. Help me prepare for that. what would that look like? Okay. The other work that we're doing also is human digital twins. So having a human digital twin of yourself, right? So imagine we have colleagues in different colleges, especially in the clinical sciences, where, for example, now you're trying to use it for disease progression. So imagine you have the genome of someone, but instead of a genome, why can't we have the cognitive architecture of a learner? Right? So it knows fundamentally, like we didn't even get to the neural aspects or neural substrates of learning, right? But could it model, right? If I continue not practicing and not studying, how well am I going to do in my physics final 13 weeks from now, right? Or knowing what you know about me, help me come up with a training regimen, right? That is going to help me be successful in this class, right? So kind of, I think what we're missing, Professor Sawyer, is all of our models, frameworks, et cetera, are all still very descriptive and somewhat prescriptive, but when are we going to get to the explanation, right? Explain to me why I would not do very well, why I would do very well, et cetera. It's almost like wearing your Fitbit, right? Or Apple Watch. Sure, I go to the gym class, I turn it on, and then I'm done. It's like, oh, it gives me a summary. Well, that's great. But that summary now is history, right? Should I continue the same level of activity, right? Given my age, let's say preconditions, medical conditions, et cetera. Like, should I increase my level of activity, decrease my level of activity? And that's kind of the similar analog, if you will, in terms of learning. Like when are we going to get to projecting? Help me project into the future, right? Using that AI, if possible, and learn and have these systems continuously learn who we are, if they really are going to be an embodiment of who we are as learners, right?
That's a fascinating suggestion. I don't think I've heard quite exactly that recommendation for the field of AI and education. We're reaching the end of our time. This is the Science of Learning podcast, and I'm Keith Sawyer. If you've enjoyed this interview, uh, please check out the other episodes in the Science of Learning podcast and consider subscribing to the Science of Creativity channel. And Professor Roger Azevedo, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Keith Sawyer. This has been a wonderful, and thank you so much for the opportunity. And yes, if anybody's interested in metacognition, self-regulation, and AI, please look us up. We'd be happy to collaborate and find out what your needs are. Thank you so much.
That was a fascinating conversation. I had 5 different topics that I wanted to talk about with Dr. Roger Azevedo, and I think we only got to 3 of them. His research going over decades has touched on so many important topics in the science of learning and AI tutors, which has, of course, become incredibly important in the past few years. And he's been studying it for years and years already. His research has influenced almost every aspect of the science of how people learn. If you've enjoyed this, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and watch the other episodes in the science of learning.